Hello, fellow fiends! Welcome to another episode of Creepy Cases and Spooky Spaces. I am your creator and host, Cassie Opea. You can find new episodes every Friday, with bonus episodes every other Tuesday for Patreon and Anchor subscribers. Now, if you would like to support the podcast without subscribing, you can do so through Cash App. And I'll actually throw a screen up that has the Patreon, the Anchor, and the Cash App as I'm describing it. So to reach me through Cash App, it is the $ COPEA. So it is the $COPEIA. And thank you so much for the support. Any little bit helps. Helps me bring the podcast to you. And so if you'd like to do that, that's great. You can also support by following on social media, creepycases.spookyspaces, and that's on Facebook, Instagram, and even Pinterest. And just comment, liking, sharing also helps with supporting the podcast because it helps bump the visual of the podcast and the awareness of the podcast. So it definitely also helps with the supporting. If you'd like to join if you'd like to be a part of the newsletter, just send me an email with your name and I'll add it. An email with your name and email, I guess. And I will add it on there. If you would also like to do any paid promotions or have ad space on the podcast, you can send me an email at creepycases.spookyspaces@gmail.com. So I guess without further ado, let's get into this week's episode. So March 2nd, 1980, in Ukiah, California, a 14-year-old boy shows up to the police station with a 5-year-old boy in tow. He tells officers, "I know my first name is Stephen." And the two young boys then go on to tell the most bizarre story on how they came to be at that police station in the middle of the night. They had actually just escaped their captor in Manchester, about 40 miles away from Ukiah. And he had kidnapped both of the boys on separate occasions. One was actually taken from Ukiah just a couple of weeks before they escaped, and the other had been taken from Merced 7 years prior, when he was just 7 years old. Now, you would think a happy ending to a tragic story, and the families could just go back to being normal, right? Well, you'd be wrong. The story isn't over. In fact, this was just the beginning of the worst nightmare scenarios that they would come to face. This is the creepy case of Stephen Stayner. Stephen Gregory Stayner was born in Merced, California on April 18, 1965. He was the middle of 5 children born to Delbert and Kay Stayner. He had an older brother, Carrie, and 3 sisters, 1 older and 2 younger. Now, Stephen was just your typical 7-year-old kid on December 4th, 1972, when he was walking home from Charles Wright Elementary School after his mother had been late to pick him up. Now, Irvin Edward Murphy approached Stephen with a stack of religious flyers, claiming to be a representative of the church who was looking for donations. And he asked Stephen if he thought his mother may be interested in donating. And Stephen said that he believed she would, so Irvin asked if he could show him where he lived. And Irvin walked him over to a white Buick with another man in the driver's seat. Now, the man was introduced as Kenneth Eugene Parnell, known to Irvin as an aspiring minister, when in reality he was actually a convicted sex offender and, according to psychologists, had issues from a very early age and needed help. He had spent 3 years in San Quentin for molesting an 8-year-old boy and 6 years in Utah for armed robbery and grand larceny. Now, Parnell worked with Irvin, who was described as sort of a naive, overly trusting, and simple man. And they worked together at the Yosemite Lodge, 2 hours from Merced. And this is actually where Parnell convinced Irvin to help him find a boy to raise him in a religious type deal. Now, although he was reluctant to get into the car, Stephen finally gave in and accepted a ride from the two strangers. And the men told him that they would take him home. And I'm sure you know that's not what happened. And it would be 7 years before his family would see him again. Now, Parnell drove a very confused Stephen into a cabin near Cathy's Valley, stopping along the way on Highway 140 to fake a phone call to his parents, where after he told him that they were okay with him staying the night. Now, sadly, Stephen didn't know that he was only a few hundred feet from his grandfather's home. Now, Parnell committed the first of many sexual assaults against Stephen the next morning. And 13 days later, Parnell actually ramped up those assaults. And when Stephen cried and told him that he wanted to go home, and he actually even escaped the cabin, but being young, lost, and scared, when he hit the street and it was dark, and he went back because he had no idea what to do when he had this little taste of freedom. So Parnell actually ended up telling him that his parents didn't want him back and there was no use in going home. And he claimed that his parents said that they didn't want him because they couldn't afford to take care of him anymore. Now, at this time, Stephen's parents had filed a police report stating that he didn't return home from school. And Parnell told Stephen that the court had granted him custody and that he had officially adopted him. And he told Stephen he legally changed his name to Dennis Gregory. I mean, he was kind enough to allow Stephen to keep his middle name, and that his last name would now be Parnell. And he even enrolled Stephen in various schools as they moved from town to town. Now, Parnell publicly posed as Stephen's father while sexually abusing him behind closed doors. And Stephen didn't really understand what was really going on. He didn't realize that he had been kidnapped, and he actually began to believe the lies that Parnell was feeding him. And slowly, the memories of his old life and family began to slip away in the midst of the trauma and stress that he was under. Stephen began calling Parnell Dad, and he went to school regularly, showing no signs of what was going on at home or the fact that he was being held against his will. Now, in a 2020 interview, one of his friends described Stephen, or Dennis as they knew him, as having a great personality. He was spunky, and you could see that he really just wanted to play and be with other kids and just be normal. And for a while, he even had a regular babysitter, Barbara Matthias. Now, the stories on her actually vary. She was a single mother, whose son Lloyd and Stephen played together. Now, Stephen claimed that she sexually assaulted him along with Parnell multiple times when he was just 9 years old, and that she even made an unsuccessful attempt on luring another child into the car with her and Parnell. Now, Barbara lived in the home for 18 months with Parnell and Stephen, and at one point, and claims to have had absolutely no idea that Stephen wasn't actually Parnell's son, stating that he even had a birth certificate for him. And she claims that she definitely didn't know about the sexual assault going on, which I find to be highly unlikely considering the severity of the assault. Now, Kathy's Valley isn't far from Merced, but investigators had no leads. And even though they put together and formed a search team the day that Stephen went missing, they just had no clues on where to look. Now, one thing that gets me though is there were flyers passed around the district, and they even were passed around the school that Stephen was attending with his photo on them. And not one person came forward to claim that they knew him. And I mean, like, sure, the name was different and things like that, but I mean, it has his picture on it, and clearly he looks the same. So I don't see why, like, how nobody came forward or how nobody noticed. Like, oh yeah, I know that kid. So now, as Parnell bounced around from job to job, the two moved around the state a lot. And this actually required him to travel or to leave Stephen unattended for periods of time. And he also allowed Stephen to kind of come and go as he pleased. And he began to give him alcohol and let him smoke, which later Stephen admitted, now this was as an adult, that he could have used these moments to leave, and he actually even thought about it. But he was young and had no idea how to even really summon help. He wasn't really quite sure how to explain or how to tell anybody what was going on at home. And he was actually worried that they would just return him to Parnell's care and that things would get even worse for him. Now, Parnell manipulated Stephen into staying. He kind of spoiled him. He gave him gifts, which one of those was a Manchester Terrier that he named Queenie. And the dog had actually been given to Parnell by his mother, who had no idea that Parnell was holding Stephen at his home. Now, Stephen shared that Parnell did a very good job convincing him that his family didn't miss him. And he would randomly fake phone calls right in front of him, refusing to let Stephen on the phone under the guise that his mother didn't want to talk to him. Now, as he got a little older, he realized that something just wasn't quite right. And he knew his parents would never just have some guys come take him off the street. But by this time, he was absolutely terrified to speak up, fearing he'd be harmed further than he already was. And he honestly believed that just no one would be able to help him. Now, once Stephen began to hit puberty and grow out of the sickening preferential age that Parnell preferred, he told him that Parnell told Stephen that he was too old to continue what they were doing, telling him that he needed Stephen to help him find another young boy. But Stephen was very much against this and basically refused to help Parnell do the things that he was doing to him to another child. And he would always find ways to secretly sabotage Parnell's sick plans. Until Parnell actually enlisted a 14-year-old friend of Stephen, or Dennis, Sean Porman, and he basically paid him $50, gave him some marijuana and booze to help him lure just 5-year-old Timmy White. And they basically told Timmy that they needed help. But Timmy said no, and he actually started to run towards his house. But Parnell told Sean to get him. Now, Poorman chased Timmy until they hit a chain link fence where he pried Timmy's tiny little fingers from the fence as he screamed in terror for his parents. He threw the boy into the car and the three sped off. And Timmy's parents were terrified. And even though the kidnapping was quite loud and quite rambunctious, no one saw anything. So on February 14th, 1980, Parnell brought Timmy home. He had already dyed the boy's blonde hair darker before introducing him to Stephen as his new brother. It was the following moves made by Parnell that kind of sent Stephen into the motivation of getting Timmy and himself away from Parnell. So, just as he did with Stephen 7 years prior, he changed Timmy's name, told him that he would be his new dad, and introduced Stephen, or Dennis, as his new brother. And he told Timmy that his parents didn't want him anymore because they couldn't afford to take care of him. Now, this made Stephen realize the severity of his and Timmy's situation. He knew that he had to get Timmy back to his family, who would be missing him, and thought that maybe, just maybe, his family may be missing him also. Now, poor Timmy cried for his parents every day. And Stephen said in an interview that he knew that he had to protect Timmy from Parnell. And he made sure that he was home from school early every day so Parnell couldn't abuse Timmy like he did Stephen. And he finally decided that they needed to leave. He told Newsweek, quote, "I couldn't see Timmy suffer. It was my do or die chance, and I would be coming home for doing something positive." End quote. Now, 2 weeks after Parnell brought Timmy home, Stephen decided to make his move. On March 1st, 1980, Parnell had left the boys home alone to go work his overnight security job at a local hotel. Now, thinking that Stephen would never defy him as he had stayed all of those years, even though he had the chance to run. So Stephen and Timmy took their chance, and despite the rain and the cold, they hitchhiked over 40 miles from Manchester to Ukiah, trying to find Timmy's house. And Stephen actually carried a tired and emotional Timmy most of the way. And now keep in mind, Stephen was only 14 years old at this time. Now, Timmy couldn't remember where he lived, so they tried his babysitter's house instead, but no luck because no one was home. So Stephen ended up looking up the police department and made their way there. Now it was actually after midnight when they arrived at the police station, and Stephen told Timmy to go inside, tell the officer his name, and that they would get him home and back to his family. Now, Timmy was frightened, and he actually didn't want Stephen to leave him alone, and he ran back to him, sobbing uncontrollably, which brought the attention of a nearby police officer. "And I know my first name is Stephen," is what he told police. And after 7 years of hoping their son would return home, the Stayner family's prayers were answered. A police officer went directly to their home at 3 a.m. to give them the good news. Stephen was alive and for the most part unharmed. Now, I know that's kind of odd to say in this situation, but it's basically just kind of like Stephen seemed pretty put together. He didn't have any major physical injuries. He wasn't bruised up. He had all of his limbs. He had all of his fingers, all of his appendages. And so, for the most part, he was unharmed. Now, Kay and Dell actually wanted to drive straight to Ukiah to pick him up. However, they were told that they would need to let police investigate. And I believe in my research, I actually found that Merced is actually like 200 and something miles away, like 260 miles away from Ukiah. So by daybreak on March 2nd, 1980, police arrested Kenneth Parnell at the hotel that he worked at. And when police ran a background check on him, they found a previous sodomy conviction from 1951. And later that day, both Stephen and Timmy were reunited with their families. Stephen had turned into an almost unrecognizable 5'10", 14-year-old to his family. Now, in a report from Time magazine, Stephen hadn't really opened up about everything that happened to him. He actually insisted that he, quote, wasn't mistreated, and the boy clearly had conflicting thoughts about his captor. The article continued to state that police say Stayner seemed fond of Parnell, who had spoiled him. And Stayner was kind of defensive about Parnell in his talks with police, and he was actually reluctant at first to even reveal his name. Yet, Stephen also said that he had no desire to see him again, which I can't fault him. It's a really crappy situation to be in because it's like you've lived this life that, or at least 7 years with someone who, in a way, was the only really parental figure that you had. In a way, he took care of Stephen, and like it was during some of the most crucial developmental years of his life. And although he was abusing Stephen, he basically manipulating him into thinking that this was the only life that he would live. This was, or, Parnell was all he had. And he, manipulated him into even thinking that he cared about him. And he was constantly being told that his parents didn't. And I'm sure that really took a toll emotionally and even logically to Stephen. Now, Stephen had trouble adjusting after he had returned to his family. He had to basically get used to structure, and he went from being able to drink and smoke, come and go as he pleased, to, following the rules. And he felt that his parents still saw him as the little 7-year-old who went missing. And once they got used to him being older and saw that he wasn't really like a small child anymore, he said that things got better. But as a parent myself, I can totally see their side of it. Like, if my daughter went missing and I was lucky enough to have her return to me, I don't care how many years later, I'd probably be a little overprotective as well. Um, so, you just fear that, well, if it happened once, it could probably happen again. Now, Kay Stayner, Stephen's mother, actually said that Stephen returned different, and like very different. And the family actually had a rough time getting used to having him home. Some of the siblings, they kind of had trouble adjusting to there being another sibling that they kind of had to share the attention with. And the media was just all over the place. And Stephen was on TV all the time, and people were showing up to interview him. And even at school, where the poor kid's just trying to learn, and he just wanted to be normal. But Stephen did return to school, where he was actually teased about being molested, which, like, I just don't understand that. Like, parents teach your children better, because it's disgusting to tease somebody about being molested. But Stephen would actually become very eerily nonchalant about what happened, and would even make jokes about it himself, which obviously a defense mechanism, most likely to keep himself from completely breaking down, but at the same time, very unhealthy. His sister said that he actually got on with his wife very well, but he was pretty messed up, quote unquote, and never got any counseling. And their father said that he didn't need any, which Sorry, but to all the parents out there, I don't care how embarrassing it is for you. I don't care how tough you think your child is. If something like that were to ever happen to them, get them counseling. Stephen actually told Newsweek in 1984 that the first year back was hectic and everything had changed, and he blamed himself. And sometimes he wondered if he should have even come home and questioned if things would have been better if he didn't. And that is a horrible way to think, to be honest. Because clearly, things are hard, things are hectic, you have all this attention on you. However, I mean, it's obviously your family wants you home, but yeah, I can understand where he's coming from, though. Now, in June of 1981, Kenneth Parnell was tried and convicted of kidnapping Timmy. And Stephen told the Evening News that he was glad about the verdict and he wasn't too worried about testifying at the upcoming trial. Now, Parnell was also found guilty of kidnapping Stephen. And although the defense stated that Stephen could have left at any time but chose not to, prosecutors argued that Stephen was a psychological prisoner and was brainwashed into thinking that he had no other option but to stay, and that Kenneth Parnell would switch between violent abuser and extraordinary freedom. And this caused major confusion to young Stephen. Now, Parnell was not tried on the sexual abuse, as the acts had happened outside of the jurisdiction, and California had a statute of limitations. And it was one of those things where the district, like the county, the district that it happened in, they would have had to charge and prosecute and go through all that. And I guess they just decided not to. Um, but he was sentenced to 7 years for the kidnapping charges, and this was the highest in California at that time. And I definitely should have researched this because I feel like it should definitely be higher than just 7 years, especially for 2 kidnappings. That's 2, not just 1. And he was actually paroled after 5 years. However, in 2004, he was convicted of attempting to buy a 4-year-old boy for $500, and he was trying to set this deal up with his home health care nurse. He was sentenced to 25 years due to the 3 strikes policy in California, and he died in the state prison hospital in 2008. Disgusting. Irvin Murphy, who helped kidnap Stephen, was convicted on kidnapping and conspiracy to kidnap, and he served 2 out of his 5-year sentence. And he said that he truly believed Parnell was a minister and never thought he'd hurt a little boy. Now, I know that they say he was simple and naive and very overly trusting, but come on. Sean Poorman, who helped kidnap Timmy, was convicted as a minor and spent time in a juvenile facility. Now, Stephen Stayner was able to move forward in life, and there was even a movie about his situation made, but he also self-medicated a lot and became quite addicted to alcohol. Now, he did meet Jody Edmondson, and together they had 2 children. He worked at a local pizza parlor, and one night, September 16th, 1989, he was actually on his way home from work on his Kawasaki EX500 when a Plymouth Velar pulled out and hit him, and the driver actually ended up fleeing the scene. Now, Stephen, at just 24 years old, sadly died a short time later at the hospital. Now, he actually died the night before the Emmys, and I believe that his movie was nominated. I actually didn't see if it won or not, but I know that it was a TV miniseries, and I know that it was nominated for an Emmy. 500 people attended Stephen's funeral, where a 14-year-old Timothy White served as one of his pallbearers, and the inscription on his casket read, "Going home." Now, Timothy White was also able to live a relatively normal life thanks to Stephen's bravery. He became a Los Angeles Sheriff's Department deputy. He got married and had 2 kids, but sadly, he also died at a young age. And at just 35 years old in 2010, he died from a pulmonary embolism. Now, 2 lives brought together under traumatic circumstances, and both were taken way too soon. Now, Stephen's family asked for a park to be named Stayner Park in Stephen's memory, but this request actually was denied by the council. Because they were worried that the community would associate the park with another Stayner, and that would be Stephen's older brother, Carrie. And now I know what you're thinking. How much more could this family endure? But Carrie Stayner actually threw the family into the media headlines yet again in 1999. Only he would make headlines for a completely different reason. He actually became known as a serial killer after murdering 4 people. And if you're a Patreon or an Anchor subscriber, you can actually hear all about Carrie Stayner on this Tuesday's bonus episode. And it's actually the last bonus episode of the season. And next Friday is actually the last episode of season 4. I would say it's a surprise. However, it's also a surprise to me because I actually haven't decided. I'm going back and forth between 2 or 3 topics of interest. So I guess you'll find out throughout the week when I start posting about it. Now, while the committee may not have named the park after Stephen, there is a statue in his honor of, it's actually in honor of Stephen and Timothy, and it actually shows the 2 boys hand in hand while escaping their captivity. Yeah, and that's all I have for you on that topic. Like this video, share this video, comment, tag somebody who might actually know the family or know about it. I'd love to hear if there's any kind of details that I missed in my research. I looked through a lot of different news articles, there is a documentary right now on Hulu called Captive Audience, and it's actually interviews with Stephen's family, and that's actually pretty interesting. And episode 3 actually talks about more so about Carrie and his case. However, you'll be able to hear more about that on Tuesday. But yeah, definitely comment, like, share, follow on social media, subscribe to the channel, follow on your favorite podcast platform. Check if you're actually listening on your favorite podcast platform. You can now watch me tell you about these details on YouTube. And so with that, see you next crime. Creepy Cases and Spooky Spaces with Cassiopeia is a Pizza and Pigtails production. All episodes are researched, written, and edited by yours truly. You can find new episodes every Friday, with bonus episodes coming out every other Tuesday. You can find the podcast on your favorite listening platform, or now you can find it on YouTube as well. Don't forget to follow along on social media, creepycases.spookyspaces, for all future news, updates, and maybe some content that you won't find on the podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe so you can get access to bonus content, early access to content, and a couple of little thank you swag. If you'd like to contact me about appearing on a future episode, maybe you would like to suggest your own creepy case or spooky space, or maybe you'd also like to reach out about ad space, you can reach me directly at creepycases.spookyspaces@gmail.com, or feel free to reach out through those social media platforms as well. And as always, see you next crime.